Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Korda. During this series of Spotlight, we're going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. My guest today is Father Joe Witmer. Welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you, Father Korda.
It's nice to have you on the show and to find out a little bit more about you, but also about some of what you remember about the beginnings of our diocese. And we're going to talk about some of those things, but also your involvement with ecumenical dialogue and relationships, which we'll talk about probably a little later on in our show. But to start with, give the folks that are with us a little background about yourself, when you were ordained and the year that the diocese was celebrating at that time.
Well, I was born in 1941, so I was 2 years under the Cleveland Diocese that way. But ordained in 1967, which was, of course, 2 years after the end of Vatican Council II, which had a lot to do in the last years of preparation, and it was a time of great enthusiasm and hope.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that because in my early studies, of course, I graduated from high school in 71, so really wasn't ordained until 79, but we were always taught in the new ways. Mm-hmm. And so Vatican II was really very new when both of us really were studying and ordained. So why do you think that vigor and that zeal for the newness of it all was so prevalent in the church then?
I think the discussions that took place around Vatican II, the new topics, religious freedom, the document Nostra Aetate about relationship with non-Christian religions, and of course ecumenism in itself was something brand new. I can remember in my early high school days, I played the piano for the Canton Police Boys Club choir. One of the boys had an older sister who was getting married, both of them Protestant, and they knew I knew how to play the organ too, so they asked me if I would play the organ for the wedding. I had to ask 5 priests before I got one that said I could do it. So it was a different world.
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk also about your early recollections of our ordinaries in the diocese. Obviously, you were ordained when Bishop Walsh was still the ordinary, but Bishop Malone was the apostolic administrator, I believe.
That would be correct.
So what are your recollections, if any, about Bishop Walsh?
Not much. We were taken over to see him right after we were ordained, to have a brief conversation with him and to receive his good wishes.
And he was probably ailing at that time?
He was. Of course, it was 1966 when Bishop Malone, then auxiliary, became the apostolic administrator. And so it was certainly that led into his council review days. Those of us who are older remember those. A lot of people gathered at St. Columba Cathedral to hear visiting scholars talk about their recollection. Some of them were even people over at the council at the time, and it made for excitement.
Well, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. We know that when Bishop Malone was there, he was to be one of the youngest bishops at the time present for the Vatican Council. And coming back to our diocese with such great enthusiasm, you obviously saw that in him and experienced that in some of the things that he said. Was there anything that really stuck out in your recollection about his experience of Vatican II?
I think the idea that already in 1969, Bishop Malone led the Diocese of Youngstown and three other Ohio dioceses into the Ohio Council of Churches. And some discussions had to take place so that our brothers and sisters of other religions would feel comfortable welcoming us into the life of the council. But there's a document that points out that probably the issue of abortion would be one that the council really couldn't take up, at that time at least, but didn't seem anything else that was going to be difficult.
Let's, in our last few minutes of our first segment, let's talk about the Ohio Council of Churches. What exactly is that organization, and why at that time were we part of it?
Well, it is the statewide structure for Christians of different denominations, and so that they can discuss together certain topics. One of the early topics that I can remember was a discussion about whether the council should support, be neutral, or seek to oppose this new suggestion of a lottery that was going to help fund public schools. And Bishop Malone was the bishop at the time. The United Methodist bishop of the East Ohio Conference was sort of leading the opposition, but he couched it in terms of the morality, the immorality of gambling. And a number of Catholic priests were there with collars on, and they said, "We all got bingo in our parishes. How can we do this?" And Bishop Malone called a recess, and the makers of the motion got together, and it ended up that the council did indeed oppose, but not on the issue of morality, but on the issue of a very insecure way of trying to fund something so essential as public education.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. How has been our relationships with the Protestant community since that time?
Well, 3 members of the Diocese of Youngstown have been president of the Ohio Council of Churches. Bishop Malone was the first, I was the second, and Bonnie Workman from the Canton area was the third Catholic from Youngstown to preside.
So our influence and participation has been significant over these many years.
It has.
We're going to take a break in just a moment, but before we do that, we're going to let the folks know that we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about ecumenism, because you have been an ecumenical officer for the Diocese of Youngstown for a number of years, and we're going to focus on that in just a moment. But we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Catholic Diocese of Youngstown was established on May 15, 1943. 2018 marks the 75th anniversary of the diocese. There are 6 counties which make up the Diocese of Youngstown: Ashtabula, Columbiana, Mahoning, Portage, Stark, and Trumbull. There are 5 other dioceses in the state of Ohio, Cincinnati being the oldest, Cleveland, Youngstown's mother diocese, Columbus, Steubenville, and Toledo. Youngstown is the smallest in terms of area, and the second smallest in terms of population. Yet it has the 3rd highest percentage of people identifying themselves as Catholics. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. It was in Dungannon, Ohio, in Columbiana County, that the first group of Catholics settled. St. Philip Neri, the first parish in all northern Ohio, was founded in 1817 under the title of St. Paul's Settlement. It was to visit this settlement that Father Edward Fenwick, the Apostle of Ohio, made his first trip to northern Ohio. 4 years later, Cincinnati was chosen as the see city in the state of Ohio, and Fenwick was selected as the first bishop. Today, St. Philip Neri remains the oldest parish in the Diocese of Youngstown, but it is also one of the smallest. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm talking with Father Joe Witmer. Before we took a break, we were talking about your involvement in the diocese's involvement in ecumenism. What I'd like us to talk about now is how you were chosen to represent our diocese in the broader ecumenical relationships with other Christians at the United States Catholic Conference. So let's talk about that and how that was about, how that came about, and your particular role in that.
Okay. Ever since about 1970, there's been a national network of diocesan ecumenical and interreligious officers, one from each diocese. And I was participating in that. My first national workshop on Christian unity was in 1972. And Bishop Malone took me to my first one and got involved in that network. And then in 1979, the predecessor as the associate at the ecumenical office was returning to his diocese of Birmingham, Alabama. And I got a call from Bishop Malone saying that he had said yes to a request that I be invited. So he told me, if you want it, take it. If you don't, say no. And so I went down to Washington and was interviewed. And they heard my experience and invited me to come, which I readily said yes. And I said, the experience that I had in Youngstown would be very helpful to me. They said, you'd be working with Orthodox. How do you feel about that? And I said, fairly comfortable, because we have many Orthodox in the Mahoning Valley, and some of whom I had become familiar with. And so went down to Washington. I staffed on the Catholic side the dialogue with the Episcopal Church, with the United Methodist Church, with Christian Church Disciples of Christ, with the Eastern Orthodox churches, with the Oriental Orthodox churches, and the Scholars Dialogue with Southern Baptists. Bit of a spectrum.
Sure.
But a fascinating experience.
In those many years that you were there, not only representing our diocese as a diocesan priest, but also in the bigger picture, what were some of the main issues that you call to mind that affected the Christian church that might still affect us today?
Of course, the ecumenical movement is the desire to restore the unity that used to exist. And a lot of discussions have been and still are necessary. In the dialogue with the Lutherans that my boss staffed, there was a lot of maturing in theological dialogue, which led at the international level in 1999 to the signing between the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation of the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, which was a large event in Lutheran Catholic relations, and which led, because of interest by the Lutheran churches in northeastern Ohio to celebrate that in the Valley, to our decision then to establish a covenant between the Northeast Ohio Synod and the diocese, pledging ourselves to prayer, study, and action.
And gladly that continues today.
It does.
Yeah. Let's talk about your involvement with the Orthodox community. We know that in the Diocese of Youngstown we have a relationship in talking with our brothers and sisters of the Orthodox faith. So in your past experience with the Orthodox Church, how has that been and where are we going with that?
There's no headquarters of a eparchy or whatever of the Orthodox in the Mahoning Valley. So mostly we're just local folk trying to develop that rapport, that understanding, and hopefully leading to a desire for greater unity than we yet know. And this has been fostered in the Valley mostly by the Society of St. John Chrysostom. Not only an international body, but a national body. And we in this area were among the first local expressions of it. We have not only Eastern Orthodox, but interestingly enough, in Howland Township, outside Warren, is the only community of Coptic Orthodox nuns outside Egypt. So one would say, wow. So it's a lot of interest there. The convent that they reside in used to be a Byzantine Catholic convent. And when those sisters moved down closer to St. Peter and Paul in Warren, the Coptic Orthodox were willing to move in and make that their home.
Very good. You know, the whole thrust of ecumenism has really been part of the church, especially since Vatican II. Why is it so important for us to be in dialogue with other Christians?
Well, it's hard to say yes to somebody you never meet. This has to do with two people wanting to get married. It has to do with people wanting to be in closer union with one another. Part is understanding the history. Part of it is understanding the theology. Part of it is understanding the liturgical traditions, how they are similar and how they are different, but also just the rapport between priests, especially in the Orthodox traditions, who will not be in the Valley the rest of their lives. They'll probably be some other places. But if they can take with them to their new place good memories of good relationships, that's a blessing for the wider church.
Before we take a break to finish our middle segment, going on to the last segment, explain the word ecumenical and ecumenism for the folks that are with us who may not be familiar with what exactly that means.
Okay. Ecumenical describes the reality of a church that is one and universal, but yet is broken in many ways. So ecumenism is the movement to try to restore that unity. It's happening between different sets of churches at a different, shall we say, timeline. There's a number of Protestant churches who have merged over the years. Others are in what they call full communion relationships. In other words, if, let's say, there's very few people in denomination 2 in this area, if they're in communion with another church, these people should feel open to being ministered to by a minister of the other church. Or if there's nobody here, that they could be welcomed into the other church. So ecumenism has a different flavor, and let's say the heat is at different degrees on different burners.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be right back. Miles from the first Catholic parish in all of Ohio, in a place called Canton, Catholics gathered in 1817 to celebrate Mass with Father Fenwick. Because of limited building space, the Mass was held outdoors under a huge oak tree. The spot, near the present Church of St. John the Baptist, which was established in 1823 as the second oldest parish in the Diocese of Youngstown. The oak tree grew there until 1906, when it was struck by lightning. To preserve it, the parishioners took the wood and carved a chair out of it, which remains in the church today. In 2012, St. John the Baptist was elevated to a basilica. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm talking with Father Joe Witmer. In our middle segment, Father Joe, we were talking about our dialogue and relationship with the Lutheran community and the covenant that we entered into. Let's bring that back for the folks that are with us, a little history of how that started and who was instrumental in that.
Certainly. A local Lutheran layperson was on their Northeast Ohio Synod Board, and he said, the focus of the Northeast Ohio Synod seems to be Akron Canton. Can't we do something in the Mahoning Valley that the Lutherans who are here can feel encouraged and involved in? So Bishop Marcus Miller, this is early year 2000, approached Bishop Tobin, and there was a luncheon, and Bishop Marcus Miller asked Bishop Tobin if he would be open to having a celebration on the first anniversary of the signing of that joint declaration in October, then first anniversary 2000. And Bishop Tobin said readily, that's fine, but I think we ought to do more. I think we ought to enter a covenant with one another and commit ourselves to prayer, study, and action. The covenant was written and signed at that first anniversary celebration and has been unfolding ever since.
And we know that in 2017 there was a significant celebration honoring the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, but also our continued dialogue with the Lutheran Church and the Catholic community. Let's talk also about why it's important for us as priests to be involved in ecumenical dialogue. Both of us are involved with the Lutheran Commission. You have been involved with it a lot longer than I have. But in our parish work and in our community relationships, we've gotten involved with local groups, ecumenical groups, interfaith groups that have gotten together to talk about those issues that affect all of us, and also to look more at a closer union with one another. So why is it important for us as leaders, as parish leaders, community leaders, to be involved in this dialogue?
A growth in understanding is so important, because if you just think that ecumenism is nothing but not doing bad things to the other, that's pretty easy. But trying to share information, share history, share where there's changes. We could talk about Vatican II. What is promising and what are things that attention needs to be paid to as things continue to unfold. Especially in the last years since Vatican II, there's more and more exposure to ecumenism in the seminary, and therefore, hopefully, a little bit of confidence in making these contacts, making these, joining a clergy association. In the Mahoning Valley, we have an association of churches, and it's not all clergy, it's lay people too. And so the more knowledge they have, the more enthusiasm they can bring.
And the Diocese of Youngstown has been involved in these organizations and community structures for years.
Correct.
Celebrating our anniversaries together. We know that the Mahoning Valley Association recently celebrated a 100th anniversary. So in celebrating these anniversaries and in continuing our dialogue with one another, what does that say about our future?
One cannot really talk about that you do this, you'll get that result. Nothing's that easy. But if you're not a player, if you're not there, if you're not listening, if you're not thinking, if you're not acting together, very little will happen. So it's a matter of, if there's any prayer for, any desire for greater unity, then people must be involved.
And let's talk about that. specific week of prayer for Christian unity that we celebrate as Christians every year, usually around January, and centering also around the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul. So why is it significant for us to engage, especially during that week, not just every day, but especially during that time?
Right, it's a time to focus our attention on that. The priest, the chair of St. Peter, and then the Feast of St. Paul. 8 days later, that was the octave or the week of prayer. This was founded by a religious order who at that time was attached to the Anglican Church in England. But then in the United States, these Greymoor friars became Catholics. And now they are the ones, on behalf of the Vatican and East in the United States, of translating and preparing the materials for the annual week of prayer. So it's a time to say, we could do it any time, but how about if we do it now? Others found there's other problems, especially in the northern part of the country, a thing called snow, that maybe Pentecost is a better time of year to do this. But find some time and getting consensus on that, that's the challenge.
It's interesting you bring that up in our last 2 minutes of our time together. I've often thought of this, that when we talk about ecumenism and interfaith dialogue and relationships with other Christian communities, that we try to look at that sense of renewal and rebirth and trying to be refreshed. And what better time than Pentecost, the birthday of the church, to actually celebrate something like that? And how important and what a wonderful statement it would make if Christians together would celebrate our diversity, but also looking forward to our unity during Pentecost.
Amen.
In closing, what would you like to share with the folks very briefly about ecumenical dialogue?
It's happening at different places, at different tempos, but climb on board. A lot of information can be found at the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, usccb.org, and go on to, I think it's beliefs and teachings, and one of the subcategories there is ecumenical. And go under there, and you can find the different dialogues and topics that have been treated by each of the dialogues. That'll get you a little more familiarity and get your foot into the water.
Father Joe Witmer, thank you for being with us and celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.